everyone for this last third conference. Thanks for bearing with me for the third time. So far I have moved in kind of well-trodden territory. Of course, we're moving through Papyri mostly. This time, I must admit, I am sailing in uncertain waters. This presentation I asked to do it because I was curious mostly about this person, Grigol Tsereteli, and because I thought that it might have been useful or at least agreeable to a Georgian audience, so here I am. I had to make my own research for this, and I hope that I did not make any blatant mistake, but if I did, I ask for your forgiveness in advance. The quotation that I put in the title, Ad Maiorem Georgiae Gloriam, is by Tsereteli himself, who in his later years became some of a patriot in favor for what he called the homeland of his father. The image, unfortunately, is just a random papyrus I had in my database because there are no images of P.Ross Georg so far available except some plates in the original volumes when they are printed, which were honestly not particularly beautiful to show you, if you are familiar with the volumes. And here we go. So, since I started from scratches, my first obvious way of uncovering anything about this collection was to go where? To the usual haven for papyrologists when they want to acquire information on a collection. They go on Trismegistos, the search engine I spoke to you last Tuesday. And especially there is a section of Trismegistos called Collections, which will tell you how many collections of papyri are in any nation in the world you select. Usually the more intense is the color, the more intense is the collection, the more widespread, the more numerous is the collection itself. And if I try Tbilisi, this is going to be the result. So it says, basically, you see every collection, the collection of the Georgian National Museum, the Kekelidze Institute, the Museum of Fine Arts, the private collection Maximova, and the Nachlass of Tsereteli. It will tell me how many items are contained in each collection, and what is the ID number that Trismegistos TM Col gives to any of these collections. It's a census, basically, very precise. You go through it, you will find that, for instance, I was wondering about what collections have only one papyrus. So in one case, it's a P.Ross Georg, an amulet against demons from the 6th AD. This is preserved in the Georgian National Museum. And the other single item is technically not a papyrus, but a bronze tablet in Arabic from late 7th AD. It's serial number, not incidentally, is not P dot, which would mean a papyrus, but TEE, Tabulae Epigraphicae Iranica, or something like that. The lion's share, of course, is from the Kekelidze Institute. They have a lot of them. We have been there, by the way, I think. And of course, there are these two private collections, the Maximova and the Tsereteli. All these items that I've circled for you can be classified under this now commonly accepted in papyrology sigla P.Ross Georg. Okay, P.Ross Georg, what does... Let us pretend we do not know what P.Ross Georg means. You go to the checklist of editions of Greek, Latin, Demotic, and Coptic papyri, ostraca, and tablets. Once again, this is not a function of Trismegistos, but of papyri.info, which is the other essential search engine for papyri. And when you go to P.Ross Georg, it will solve for you the abbreviation in Papyri, Russische und Georgische Sammlungen, the volume containing them, Tiflis, Tbilisi. They are online, by the way, they're all digitized, so it will give you the link, and it will tell you how many volumes do you have, what is their title, who is their editor, when they came out, and how many of them are there. Plus, it will tell you that this and that are online in papyri.info, so you can go directly to the texts because they were incised. There is a recurring name, of course, the name of Grigol Tsereteli, which is Normally I find in these last years it is transliterated with a Z at the beginning. There are some authors, especially very old authors, which will transliterate it with a C, and others who will transliterate it with a TS. I believe that it's basically because people don't really know, or they don't have a specific rule to transliterate a specific Georgian letter. That said, we will discuss later the titles of the volumes, but basically they are in a way chronologically oriented. You have the literarische Texte, then chronologically Ptolemaic und frührömische Texte, so early Roman period, late Ptolemaic and early Roman Egypt, late Roman spätrömische und byzantinische Texte, so Egypt from Diocletian to the Arab conquest, a specific Sammlung Lichashov, who was Russian, basically coming from the Come of Aphroditopolis in Egypt, and a fifth volume of Varia, whatever, which contains papyri, tablets, ostraca. It's more like a volume of misses, let's say. So there was a sixth volume planned, but it never came out. As I said, there is a common occurrence. I'm seeing the name of Grigol Tsereteli all over the volumes. It seems to be very much present, together with Jernstedt and Kruger. So let's see, who is this guy? Where do I find information about a papyrologist? Third bibliographical item that I'm presenting to you today, this object, Hermae. It's not an easy gathering of volumes to find. They are very heavy, very huge, printed by a very expensive publishing company in Italy, which we are trying to boycott because he makes his books obscenely costly. So if you need, but we have it in Bologna, so if you need any kind of photograph or scan, we will be very happy to not let you buy anything from the thief. Hermae is a collection of, so far, I think, 5 volumes. Scholars and Scholarship in Papyrology is the subtitle, and it has been published by the late Mario Capasso, Papyrology from Puglia, and it contains lives, biographies and bibliographies of all famous papyrologists like ever in the world. And of course there is a huge profile of more than 30 pages devoted to Grigol Tsereteli. Once again, the guy who wrote it, who I believe was quite old when this article came out, still uses a very old transliteration with C. Unfortunately, the article is in Italian. This person, I believe, is Israeli, so he writes either in Russian or in Israeli, in Hebrew. But for Hermae, he had this article translated in Italian. The problem is that this article is a revised version of older articles he wrote, so in fact it is the most complete you can find, but it is not in a very accessible language, I mean my own. So this is an obstacle if you want to read it, if anyone wants to read it, that may be present later, but it's language barriers can be jumped through if we put an effort to it. The first thing that jumps to our eyes is that there is a question mark on the year of his death, as if we didn't really know when he died. The question marks hints at something fishy happening at the end of this person's life. Nevertheless, the life of this person was remarkable. He is today remembered as the founder of modern Greco-Roman studies in Russia, and in the same role, he was the founder or one of the founders of the Greco-Roman studies in Georgia itself. So he is at the core of Greco-Roman studies in 2 countries, not just one. There's very little in terms of pictures online, by the way. You have a picture of it hanging in the director's office, which would be nice actually to photograph and widespread, because the only thing I find is that, which is, I mean, yes, it's definitely him, but it's a little, you know, one would expect a little more. Fichman describes this person with a lot of adjectives. So he says classical philologist, paleographer, papyrologist, Byzantine scholars, publisher of documentary and literary texts from antiquity and Middle Ages, translator of ancient classics and modern classics of mondial, of world literature, chief of the Soviet Papyrological School, which is a little, I mean, considering he never loved particularly Soviet Russia or the Bolsheviks, which is a little, you know, squishy, and founder of classical philology in Georgia, professor in the University of Yuriev of St. Petersburg and of Tbilisi, and corresponding member of the Russian Science Academy. This is a lot of titles for a single person, but it is typical of scholars of his generation. These people were supermen and superwomen of our studies. They accumulated a lot of qualifications. Now we consider ourselves fortunate if we can have 2 specializations instead of 1. These people who specialize in literally everything in the world concerning humanities. Once again, it was a different lives. It's not like they were more considered or had more luck applying for funds, but it seems they had much more time than we have now in their hands. He was born in St. Petersburg and he is always considered himself Russian. His mother is Russian, but his father was Georgian. Here's the gap. He spent some childhood years in Tbilisi, not enough years to learn the Georgian language. He never knew that. He could never learn it. And in his life we can distinguish very sharply between a Russian period, which lasted in the 1920s, and a Georgian period where he actually lived and taught in Tbilisi. His father belongs to the bureaucratic intelligentsia of Tsarist Russia. He worked for the military in the capacity of a lawyer, and he moved very often from Tbilisi to St. Petersburg, from St. Petersburg to Warsaw, where he was dismissed honorably for health reasons with his wife Anna Ivanovna Luchak, and their children, as far as I can tell, there were 2, Grigol and Elena, his sister. The relationship between Tsereteli and Georgia is complicated. He often refers to Georgia as my father's homeland rather than my own. But later in his life, he feels a sense of isolation, like I am an immigrant with no real haven, that's what he says, because he has troubles in Russia, in Soviet Russia. He has troubles in Georgia, he has troubles wherever he goes, so he travels a lot, and he feels like an unrooted person, a person without real roots. He finds later in his life, especially when he is working in Tbilisi, an attachment to this country, which he had not in the early years. He often repeats in his private letters, this won't be a shame for the Georgian land, or ad maiorem Georgiae gloriam, this specific Latin sentence which tells very much about the feeling he had to this place. Most of his problems, in fact, didn't really come from Georgia, but from Russia. His open comments on the Russian political turmoil were his downfall at the end, and tell us that he felt particularly involved with Russia too, which he considered actually his concrete homeland. Surprisingly, because I didn't know that could happen for males too, he was home educated by his mother and aunt together with his sister Liena. Then he went to gymnasium. He pursued a degree in history and philology, which means everything concerned with the ancient world. I read that he also learned Sanskrit, Slavic literature, Akkadian and whatever. And in this specific field he blazes a trail, because he's basically a gatherer, a collector of medals and awards. He has collected medals and awards all his life. He earned his degree at 23-year-old in 1893, and he immediately began to work in an university environment. University was his life. Academic life was his chosen path of life. Because he's already a professor, although he has a very, not that I understand the subtleties of academic career in Tsarist Russia, honestly, because he had like 9 different appointments in 10 years, each of which, don't ask me what it consisted in because I do not know. Now academic steps of career are more simple. Back then they were complicated. We know that a few years later he also began to extensively travel abroad, working, we know, on papyri collections, mostly on the advice of his colleague Mikhail Rostovtsev and of his teacher Erasmus. We know that he traveled in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, in England, in France, and we know that everywhere he was very well received. He was very proud of how much he was loved by his colleagues. And everywhere he went, he made himself notable. He made himself seen. Why do we know all that? Fichtman had access to an immense nachlass, an inheritance of letters, private letters. He wrote to friends, he wrote to colleagues, he wrote to his wife, to his sister, to his brother-in-law, to his parents, to everyone. Especially what interests us mostly is the letters he wrote with his colleagues in other European countries. Wilken, Wierek, Schubert in Wessel in Austria, Wilken, Wierek and Schubert in Germany, Vitelli in Italy, Grenfell and Dante and Mahaffy in Oxford, Diels and Wilamowitz Möhlendorf in Germany again. He is described, it particularly seems, of course he distinguishes himself in classical philology and Byzantine studies as well, but he seems particularly keen in this period in deciphering papyri, and not incidentally, all the people that I mentioned up there are papyrologists. Whenever he travels, he goes to the local papyri collection and works on the papyri. Definitely that must have been a very solid training for him. Once back in St. Petersburg after these years of traveling, he gets another degree in Greek literature specifically and becomes Privatdozent at the university. It's the only thing I understood because it's a German title, although we are in St. Petersburg. Academics will travel, yes, he traveled, yes, again. In 1902 to 1905, he finally becomes full professor of classical philology and Greco-Roman antiquity, not in St. Petersburg, but in Tartu in Estonia, which back then was part of the Russian Empire, and it was called Dorpat University. Tartu was back then called Yuriev, if I understand correctly. In Tartu, he develops, or at least he emphasizes very much his interest in Greek literature because he's very fresh from that degree. So Byzantine manuscripts, but yes, Greek literature, but papyri. Menander is basically Greek literature at its best, but he works on an author which is mostly transmitted to us by papyri. This, again, is not incidental. He very much marries off his two interests in that respect. And once again, starts again traveling Berlin, Bonn, once again Venice, Genoa, Dresden, Leiden, Praga, Rome, once again connecting with scholars everywhere in the world. The gargantuan personal archive which Fichtman had access to is not in the same place. It's widespread between, I believe, here and St. Petersburg and other places all over the world. But it is made up not just of letters, private letters, but also of documents, drafts, transcriptions, and a lot of study documents he had. We arrived to 1913, just before the catastrophe struck Russia in the capacity of World War I, basically, which put the country on its knees and favored very much Russian revolution. And in 1913, supreme irony, he received the third 300 years medal of the Romanov dynasty, which is the peak of his career and of his fame. He is now a world-famous and well-published also scholar. Now he is in St. Petersburg, where he transferred from Tartu in 1914. Once again, he's full professor and fellow of the Russian Academy of Science. And these are his last years in Russia, 1914 to 1920. Then suddenly, in 1920, he's called to Tbilisi and begins his Georgian period. He will never come back from Georgia. His feelings are very Russian, we have said that. He cannot speak the Georgian language. He refers to Georgia as the homeland of my father. but he must definitely have seen the opportunity of leaving Bolshevik Russia, which he did not particularly feel comfortable in. He had been arrested, incidentally, in 1919 because he could not keep his mouth shut about the new government. He must have found very conducive to his purpose that Georgia in 1920 was an independent, officially non-Bolshevik state, but the thing tragically retorted against him when Georgia was annexed a year later by Soviet Russia. When teaching in Tbilisi in the 1920s and most of the 1930s, he started his project of the Papyri, Russische, for God's sake, und Georgische Sammlungen, which are now the P.Ross Georg. I will speak on this particular collection later. I just gave to you a few images of the books. He complains very much about his life, his academic life, not just in Russia, but in Georgia too, mostly because of his salary, which was never particularly huge. But again, academic salaries in general, I do not recall that they have been particularly enticing unless you work in Oxford and in STEM. But in every other corner of academia, we are always paid as little as we can. Not just that, but since now Georgia is a Bolshevik country, his political opinions once again are a problem. He had reportedly a very irritable and impulsive temper. He could not keep his mouth shut, which means that when he did not like something, he was explicit about it. He was never an ardent monarchist. He reportedly defined the Romanov dynasty of degenerate, especially at the end of World War I. But still, he did not like Russian Revolution, and he did not like the communists. So in 1931, while still teaching in Tbilisi, he is again in jail for no less than 6 months. This time he was saved by his wife, Sofia Ivanovna, who petitioned for his liberation. By the way, in the petition, she stresses very much his commitment, his devotion to Georgian youth, and the progress of the Georgian Bolshevik Republic thanks to his activity, which, yes, of course, it's a petition. One must, flourish facts a little, but still, we do not see why that was an outright lie. He probably was particularly invested in this country at this time, which this country was become, in fact, his own country. Third and last time he is arrested in 1938. These are bad years. The great Stalin massacres have begun. Allegedly by mistake, the secretary for the Georgian Communist Party mentioned that Tsereteli, whom he wanted arrested, but it was another Tsereteli, not that specific Tsereteli. Anyway, they took him. This time, Sofia Ivanovna once again desperately tried to have him liberated, but her petitions were never answered. He underwent trial, and he was sentenced on May 31st, 1939 to 10 years of jail and deportation in Siberia. He probably died in the same year. Rumor has it that he died while being transported by train, and his corpse was dumped somewhere along the journey in the snow. No one knows precisely when and where. The testimonies are very uncertain in this respect. His wife, in 1941, believed he might have been still alive, but she had no news about it. Anyways, that's the question mark in 1939. Yes, maybe he died in transportation, maybe he died a year later in a prison camp. We do not really know. It is a sad ending for a very rich life. He was not the only one, unfortunately. Now we come to not his only notable work, but one of the most impressive work which he conducted, the P.Ross Georg. Discussing the origin of a collection is once again a very trendy topic now among papyrologists, because in the last 20 or 30 years the very problematic topic of understanding how we came into possession of papyri in the West has become, very relevant, because countries to which we took them, back then colonies, are now independent states who do not like very much their archaeological patrimony, their archaeological treasures being scattered everywhere in Europe, in America, in Russia, or in Australia. Colonies like Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, and mandates like Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, not colonies, but kind of. Papyri and ostraka come mostly from these countries, and these countries would like to have them back, at least part of them. Because some of these excavations, some of these findings were legally acquired and amicably shared with the institutions, but most of them were not. So what of the P.Ross Georg? Is repatriation necessary? Apparently I don't think it is, because they were not excavated, but all of them were bought in a moment when buying was legal in Egypt. The information on the collection of the P.Ross Georg comes from the article of Helena, sorry, I tend to call her Aliona because I personally met her in Vienna and everyone calls her Aliona, but her name would be Liena in Russian. Sorry for my pronunciation. Liena Chepel. Russian Collections of Greek Papyri and History of their Publication, an overview in this journal, Egypt and Neighboring Countries, pages 57 to 80. I find particularly interesting, and now you confirm this for me, the first note says, this article was carried out within the framework of the international joint Austrian-Russian research project from the Nile to the Caucasus, Grigol Tsereteli and his papyrus collection, funded by the Austrian Science Fund and the Russian Foundation for Basic Research. Which makes sense because the two scholars busy in republishing the Georgian papyri of the Tsereteli collections are Elena Chepel, who is Russian, and Sophie Kovarik, who is Austrian. Of course, she begins by discussing the Russian collections, mainly split between Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow and the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. If you want to see an image of these papyri and you want to contact these establishments, these buildings, good luck. I tried for years to have images of things in the Hermitage and did not succeed. They were apparently acquired through purchases of traveling scholars in the Cairo market, so no excavations here. Only purchases, only buying and selling. And back then, what you bought in antiquities market in Cairo was legal to buy and to take out of Egypt and stays where it was brought. She speaks of Golenishev's collection, Bock's collection, and further smaller collections of Papadopoulos Kerameus and Likachev in St. Petersburg. All acquired by these traveling scholars and all sold or donated to Moscow, to the Hermitage, to the Pushkin State Museum by these people, and they make up right now the Russian papyri collections. The trend was actually inverted by Tsereteli, who acquired by himself most of these papyri for studying, and when going to Georgia, brought them with him. In fact, the collection here in Georgia may be, it probably is, more numerous, there's more material here than it is in Russia, thanks to Tsereteli. He started working on papyri thanks to his teacher Ernsted, who instructed him in Greek literary papyri and paleography at the beginning of the 900s. Without Ernsted, probably, perhaps, who knows, Tsereteli might have remained just a classical philologist or a Byzantine scholar, not also a papyrologist. Notice that he began with Greek literary papyri, his interest in menander telling in that respect. His study mission in Europe and in Italy brought him to study papyri also in other collections in Vienna, in Berlin, and in Oxford, and when it was republished material from those collections, which tells you how, in what regard he was esteemed by his European colleagues. When it comes back in Russia, he puts together what we now call the Tsereteli Nachlas, his own private collection of papyri. Some of them were acquired by his colleague Mikhail Rostovtsev, which then went to Yale, by the way. Well, Tsereteli went to Georgia, Rostovtsev went to Yale to escape the Bolshevik Revolution, and they were donated to him in 1906, 1907. Then later, Turaev, his colleague, bought more papyri to Egypt and brought them to him between 1909 and 1910. A few other items came from Golenishev's collection, which I mentioned earlier, and they were donated by the owner before he sold out to the Pushkin Museum. So the provenance, once again, is basically friends and colleagues giving him material to study. In his capacity of a Russian returned Georgian, for he basically returned to his father's homeland when he goes to Georgia, Tsereteli determines a turning point in the history of Russian collections of papyri, because in fact he creates a Georgian national collection of papyri thanks to his transfer there. He worked on the papyri while in Russia, together with his colleague Rostovtsev, of whom I spoke a few moments ago. They also tried to gather more than they had. They managed to raise 10,000 rubles from the Russian Academy of Science, but World War I intervened and thwarted their efforts. So no papyrus entered Russia after 1914. And all we have in Russia or in Georgia came from pre-World War I excavations and purchases. The panorama, the scenario of Russian Revolution was meager. His colleague fled to the USA, the other colleague had died, and Tsereteli was more than glad, as we said earlier, as we saw earlier, to accept the invitation of the newly founded University of Tbilisi, and came and went there and brought there his collection. And it was in Tbilisi, actually, that he published the 5 volumes of what would become the P.Ross Georg. The volumes do not include only papyri in Georgia, but a lot of them are papyri that had remained in Russia and still are there, as far as I know. The first volumes includes literary fragments. They were edited by Tsereteli himself. Not all of them were published, were unpublished. Some of them that were already published in 1925. The 4th volume, which collects papyri from Likachev's collection in St. Petersburg, was meant to be the 4th volume, but came out in 1927, second chronologically. The 2nd and 3rd volume collects papyri, documentary papyri from Egypt, from the Ptolemaic to the Byzantine period, and they were published by disciples, Ernsted and Kruger, together with their teacher, Tsereteli himself. And then we have a volume of Varia, random papyri, wooden tablets, and ostraca in 1935. You see the publication pace is pretty much stable, 1925, 27, 29, 30, 35. There was a 6th volume of which we have apparently in the Nachlass notes and documents, but it never came out. Shepard writes, his transcripts and drafts for this publication are now held in his personal archive in Tbilisi, so they are here. Among these, there are drafts of the editions, not only of papyri from his private collection held in Tbilisi, but also a number of unpublished texts from the Pushkin Museum and the Hermitage. The final effort of publishing all this material and republishing all the P.Ross Georg are being taken by Shepard and Kovarik. So if you are curious about it, check out their publications or contact them. I believe they were here, so you probably met them.
We know them quite well.
Yeah, sorry for...
Especially Alyona.
Exactly. Sorry for mansplaining this thing to you. I have collected for you some relevant items. The first ones are an instance of the usefulness that papyri can have in terms of literature. In the first case, yes, you have Euripides Andromache, a fragment of Euripides Andromache from a codex, I think, from 8th century AD. I mean, yes, we already have Euripides Andromache, but you always welcome a new source for the history of manuscript tradition. And the second item is from a lost comedy of Menander, Women Drinking Hemlock, the Koneiazomenai. Who knows about it? But Tsereteli was a scholar in Menander, so he was the best qualified person to study that. And then we have some typical documents that are found in every collection of papyri. Letters from the elders of an Egyptian town, a petition to the prefect, private letters from someone to his mother, receipts from rent, recruitment of boys for training as shipwrights, and then we have the items that bugs me most because it's bilingual, there's some Latin on it. It is in the Varia, and it is not a papyrus, but a wooden tablet. I'll tell you later because it bugs me so much. Okay, not really funny, but curious thing about this collection is that, and this is not only because it was in Georgia, the BGU, the volumes from the Berlin collection at the beginning of the 20th century were all copies of handwritten sheets. I don't know why they did so in Berlin and in Tbilisi or in Russia, while in Oxford they already printed volumes with papyri. But the fact is that if you look into the P.Ross Georg, you will find Tsereteli and his students perfectly tuned writing with cursive writing signaled by underlining words. And I can only think of the painstaking effort on long winter nights in trying to write this thing without making mistakes, or they would have to begin again and give them to the printer. When he does the transcription of the text, you see that he basically uses the same convention that are technically used in papyri now. So this is a known text, so he can fill the lacunae, but lacunae in the papyrus are marked by square brackets, under dots, under letters, when the letter is uncertain or only a few traces survive from it, and he marks out all accents and breathings that are in the papyrus, but if for a moment at least, he does not, for instance here, he puts breathing and accent, but when he goes to the text in the papyrus, he only puts here the accent and the breathing that are actually in the papyrus, instead of normalizing orthographically the whole text. And of course, since we have codices for here, he also makes a critical apparatus. Like Calitade, line 12, actually in the codices it's stauta de. Normal stuff for us, but back then it was the beginning of the treatment of these texts. And of course, for the Konoyazomeno of Menander, since the text is incomplete, yes, for the first column he only has the right portion of the text, he does what every other classical philologist would have done, especially German classical philologist. He completes the line because he knows Greek so well and he knows Menander so well that he can do that. Der Text der ersten Kolumne könnte folgendermaßen ergänzt werden. The könnte is the key. It might, yes it might, but then, okay, nowadays this approach is discouraged because please don't rewrite texts. But back then it was common. Because these people, Wilamowitz, Möllendorff, Diels, Grenfell and Hunt, Tsereteli himself, were so versed, so knowledgeable in ancient languages. They had read all Greek literature extant and all Latin literature extant, and they could write verses and prose in Greek and Latin even better than Greek and Latin authors. So why shouldn't we not complete a Menander's text? And the modern scholar says that and say, yeah, but what is the value of this? You don't really know, right? Yeah, but you know, it might have sounded like this. Again, this is something that we no longer like very much, unless you really want to put an appendix in your article saying, you know, I had fun doing this, but the real edition should be that with accents and breathings, not this. This belongs to another era of Greco-Roman studies. Again, I mean, he knows Greek perfectly, so he can write in iambic trimeters. He only reads eikatheu domen. He knows, but I mean, this is not completely out of thin air. He knows where the line changes because he sees the dicolon And the dicolon can be used in theater papyri in Greco-Roman Egypt to signal the change of line. So he knows that before ekatheudomen, another character started speaking. He knows not who this character is, so he puts beta, because the first character would be alpha. And since he sees katheudomen, or sleep, he puts before ion enuphnion, sleep. Again, you can do that if you really know your Greek authors. He sees talanta and pente, so he thinks, oh, money. So he puts mnas, which is another coin in Greek tradition. And then again, in Eupion, this is fine, Catheudomen, we have uke gregora, I haven't woken up. So, I mean, yes, of course, if you read the text long enough, you may begin to realize, you may begin to have your own ideas on what it contained, but this should belong to the history of studies, like instead of the history of the text. Of course, the commentary is pretty much detailed. It fills pages and pages and pages of very detailed commentary, all handwritten. That sounds very much like torture to me. Sometimes you can supply lacunae, like on the right, the letter from Plato to the elders of Papyrus is pretty much short, so these supplements are pretty much obvious and they can be accepted. Sometimes the lines are just too long. You can only supply the lacunae where you have formulae that you already know. In other cases, you leave the underdots in the square brackets, which means there were letters, but I do not know what the letters were. And there is a line-by-line commentary. At least in this case, they made some effort in indenting. But still, it seems to me a Herculean labor to do that all by hand, without a laptop, without even a writing machine. The final item of this talk is the Latin, what I call the Latin intruder of this collection. In the last volume pops up a wooden tablet, unfortunately incomplete. We can see a brief Latin text followed by a Greek translation of the same text, more or less a translation, rather a summary, actually. You see, we do not have an image, and this thing is not in Georgia, it's at the Hermitage. So there's no way for me to access it, even if I'm here. The editor dates it around 2nd to 3rd AD, but the problem is, what he couldn't know back then, but we know, the difference is vital here. Because the text is classified as a census declaration. But for someone to declare in Latin that they are a Roman citizen, the thing must probably be dated before AD 2012. Because before 2012, Caracalla's constitution was not in force, and declaring that you were a Roman citizen in Egypt was worth the effort, because you had privileges. After 2012, everyone in the empire is a citizen, and it makes no longer sense to write in Latin a document. In fact, Latin in Egypt after Caracalla's constitution drops dramatically down, because it makes no sense to use Latin if we are all citizens in the empire. So telling me to a 2nd to 3rd century doesn't really help me. I should know, at least in this case, because the document is not dated, to look at the thing, because maybe the hand, the old Roman cursive employed, might tell me, because sometimes you can distinguish between a 2nd century old Roman cursive and a 3rd century old Roman cursive, but without the image and without the object, I am unable to do so. And it is very tempting to understand this document as a census declaration, because apographomai is a giveaway. Apographe is the Greek word for census declaration. We have tons and tons of Catholikian apographai from Greco-Roman Egypt declaring how many people are in this house, what is their gender, what is their age. And in the Latin text, this person is definitely declaring the age of his kids. Annorum quattordecim, annorum undecim, annorum octo, these are kids. There's a wife, Gynaikos. There's Philia, Passionis. Marcus Aurelius is another dangerous giveaway, because usually Marcus Aurelius is a surname, is a nomen that is very widespread in Egypt after Caracalla's constitution or before, because these people felt they had been liberated by Caracalla, which was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus back then, not yet Caracalla. So there's a lot of Aureli in Egypt after 2012. But again, without the dating and without having a look at the characters, we cannot say more than what the editor said, 2nd to 3rd century, and who knows. Libellus also is another interesting word. Libellus is usually in Latin a memorandum, something that you give to the authorities to signify your own situation. If this thing was visible or an image available, this could change everything, but this is in a Russian museum, and I've written to them 10 or 12 times, and there was no answer. So, thanks for attending this 3rd lecture, and sorry for being hopeless at the end.